All right, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to this Agile 100 one-on-one with Colin Bryar. We'll see more and more people showing up throughout this interview. Those of you who will join later or who will be watching this as a recording, yes, you know, this session is going to be recorded. I'm super thrilled to have Colin join us from Seattle, west coast of the US. It's 8 a.m. And Colin is, let me give you a brief introduction to Colin. Colin joined Amazon in 1998. That was 4 years after its founding. And he spent the next 12 years of his career as part of the Amazon leadership team. And Amazon grew from a domestic, which means US only seller of books, to a global multidimensional powerhouse and innovator. And I guess most of you participating in this call are Amazon customers. And Colin served in various positions, and maybe the most interesting one was he was for 2 years the chief of staff to Jeff Bezos, which means he was basically Jeff's shadow. And during those years, he spent each day attending meetings, traveling with him, and discussing business and life with Jeff. And after he left Amazon, he of course had a lot of insights to share on how to build an organization with such a tremendous culture of innovation. And he has been sharing these insights with many, many organizations. And in his latest book, which he co-authored with his colleague, with his former colleague, Bill Carr, called Working Backwards. And my intention today is to dive into the learnings that Colin had in his years at Amazon and basically cover a lot of the insights from the book. But to those of you who haven't read the book yet, I promise you, this interview will not replace reading the book. So I highly encourage everyone to also get that book and read it. I listened to it on Audible. It was just one of those amazing books. For me, it was the best book in 2021 with regards to leadership and innovation. So I highly encourage everyone to read this. Colin, welcome to our Agile 100 one-on-one interview.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me to participate.
Great. So, Colin, you have your book basically structured in two parts. Part number one is being an Amazonian. And you cover in that part, what does it actually mean to work at Amazon? What are the principles that people follow or that the organization tries to create for people to follow? And the second part you cover, or is basically called the invention machine at work, where you take everything that you've covered in part one and apply it to specific examples, being the Kindle when that was launched, being AWS, and being Prime, and I think Prime Video, if I recall correctly. What I want to focus our interview on today is the first part of your book, because what I'm particularly interested in, many of the people that are attending this call today are clients of ours, people that work in organizations where we help them transform, become more agile, or build in more business agility, or become more innovative, or whatever you want to call this. And what I see as the number one challenge for most of these organizations is how do you create a new culture? And it's never putting some words or values or something on a piece of paper, on a poster, and put it on the wall. It's always about how do you start doing things differently. And I think you and your co-author, Bill, cover this exceptionally well. So if you don't mind, I would like to start going into those leadership principles at Amazon, and not specifically what those principles are, but how are those principles how does Amazon, how does the leadership team put those principles into practice? How do they live those things on a daily basis? And I want to start just giving you just a few questions around. So one of those principles is customer obsession, right? And I think it's the first one, actually. Can you share with us a few examples of A, what customer obsession means to you and to many people at Amazon? And then B, how is customer obsession put into practice so that it really becomes a core value of that organization?
Yeah, so great question. You know, customer obsession, it's probably, you know, the heart and soul of a key principle of what Amazon's all about. And there's a saying at at Amazon that good intentions don't work, mechanisms do. So it's not good enough just to say we're customer obsessed. Some companies say they're customer focused. Amazon uses the word phrase customer obsessed for a very good reason, because you want to wake up every day thinking about the customer experience, how you can make it better, measuring the customer experience so you know what it was, and then you can invent new things to improve the customer experience. And what a couple examples of the mechanisms, so customer obsession is an intention, but how Amazon weaves customer obsession into really most of the major processes that Amazon performs. One is called the working backwards process, which it's the name of the book, but it's also a very specific process at Amazon that Amazon uses to take an idea, to vet it, to decide whether to greenlight it, whether it's worthwhile to allocate resources in order to go build a product or service and launch it. And so working backwards, if you had to remember one thing about the working backwards process, a lot of people talk about the PR, press release, FAQ component. It's really about starting from the customer experience and then working backwards from that. And the PR FAQ is the tool that Amazon uses in order to ensure that the customer is there from the very first step of when someone has an idea in the company and travels along that journey. And it sounds simple, but it's actually different from how a lot of companies decide how they're going to vet ideas. A lot of companies use a skills forward approach. They talk about what are we good at? What are our competencies? What are our competitors doing? Can we nudge into an adjacent market? And we realized at Amazon, the word customer, we were just forgetting the word customer. So we created a new process called working backwards, just to make sure that front and center, the customer is the focus of what we're doing. That allows you then to go sometimes build things that you didn't know you needed, or your skills, you have to acquire skills you don't have, because in order to meet that customer experience. Whereas if you start from a skills forward experience, you've already cut off a bunch of possible avenues to go. Another area where customer obsession really shines is on how Amazon measures businesses. If you were to take a look at a weekly business review deck at Amazon, about 80% of the metrics in that deck would be customer-facing, controllable input metrics. And it directly measures what did our customers experience last week in whichever area you own, and then how can we get better at improving those. And if we do these things right, when they say input metrics, that means if you do these things right, it'll yield the desired result in your output metrics like revenue, free cash flow. But so, some of the things in the weekly business review deck for a retail business, for instance, would be things like, page view or app latency, retries, delivery speed, and delivery promises met, the number of new products we added that were in stock in the catalog. Have we lowered our cost structure so our prices are competitive? And then, Amazon does pay attention to competitors. A good chunk of that deck is looking at competitor prices and sites on what they're doing, because our customers are doing that. So we realized we needed that information too in order to offer the superior customer experience. So it doesn't mean forgetting competitors. It means, sometimes you need to pay attention to competitors in order to be truly customer obsessed also.
Absolutely. Oh man, that was great. So from just two words, customer obsession, we've already gone into so many tools and techniques that Amazon uses to bring this customer obsession to every person's job or day on a daily basis. And you started with the PR FAQ, and we're going to dive into this one later, because in April of this year, you wrote an interesting HBR article, again, with your colleague Bill Carr, talking about whether we've taken Agile too far. And you introduced the PR FAQ as one tool that I think a lot of Agilists could, or whatever Agilists are, right, could combine with the bi-weekly work deliveries that they do in order to become a bit more customer obsessed. No, but before we go there, I'd like to go into a few more of those leadership principles, because I find it super interesting to see how a principle is put into daily practice. Let's hit another one. And let's take the principle of ownership, which is the second one. What does that mean again, and how is it put into practice on a daily basis?
Yeah, so ownership, it states leaders are owners. They think long-term and don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. They never say that's not my job. And so one way that and this holds true for all 14 of Amazon's leadership principles. I think 14, it's unusually large for a company to have. And but I often get asked the question, well, do you have to memorize all of them? And you don't, but you end up just intuiting them and knowing them, because it's hard to avoid them in your daily life at Amazon, just because all of the processes from the ground up are built with these principles from the ground up. So one example is just Amazon's hiring process. What happens when you have an interview team, you can have about 5 to 7 interviews, just say 5 interviewers for a candidate. You get assigned 2 or 3 leadership principles in order to go vet the candidate. Has their past behavior exhibited? Do they embody these leadership principles? Because a large part of I'm setting functional interviewing aside, but a large part of the interview process is answering the question, will this person reinforce Amazon's culture or detract from it? And the best way to do that is, the culture is really that 14 leadership principles. So, one is just, I interviewed probably almost a full day a week, 5 interviews or so. And then in terms of selling candidates, debriefs, but getting 5 or 6 people together a couple times a week, really talking about all of these leadership principles and how does a candidate embody that. That's one way it just reinforces thinking about, well, what does ownership mean? But in terms of other internal processes that aren't hiring and vetting candidates for ownership, is when you're going through the annual planning process. There's you really look at it from a company perspective. You don't really get points for how big your organization is. Everyone's compensated the same way in the corporate area. It's long-term equity that vests over time. So no one's going to do something for the short term to get their quarterly or yearly bonus that would be detracting from long-term value. And so you realize that if 2 groups can work together to create something bigger, even though it may take a little bit longer, over a quarterly time horizon, they're incented to go do that. So those are, those are 2 examples where ownership takes place. And then the last one is really called single-threaded leadership. And what Amazon tries to do is assign leaders who have the capability and also the resources and the autonomy to go invent and really control their own area with as few dependencies as possible. And ownership and accountability are great to have, and then with that you can have speed to go develop and iterate on new products. So those are 3 examples where ownership is kind of woven into what the company does.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you similar to the previous one, this customer obsession, covered several areas, because none of these principles, if I remember correctly from the book, is just in one specific area. It's woven into so many things so that it really becomes part of the daily job of a leader, but also other people at Amazon, I assume. And you've also covered a few areas which I want to later deep dive on, one of them being hiring, because hiring is so crucial to every organization, and then also the development of employees. You covered organizing with the single-threaded leaders, but also the single-threaded teams to some extent, and I will deep dive on that. Communicating with the PR FAQ, but then the working backwards approach in itself and the metrics part, which we already had a bit earlier, but also in the piece of ownership where you look at the long-term perspective of things and that incentives are aligned with that long-term approach as well. Because if you don't have the incentives aligned long-term, people will automatically think short-term. So let's take one final leadership principle and then see how we can deep dive in those areas that I just mentioned. I'm particularly interested in the area dive deep, Because in many organizations that I work with today, they're trying to have leaders be primarily either visionaries, architects, catalysts, or coaches, right? And there's actually an article from McKinsey. It's the new type of leadership, VACC. And none of these acronyms covers a leader diving deep. But both Amazon and Google, similar to this, what is one of their leadership principles is for leaders to be really able to go deep into specific topics. Now, first, again, walk us through how this dive deep is lived on a daily basis. And then as an addition, how do leaders balance between giving teams autonomy while at the same time being able to dive deep themselves?
Yeah, so great question. And, you know, a lot of people think that the further you progress in your career, that you step back from the day-to-day operations and just focus on just vision and let your team members kind of figure out the details. Amazon rejected that principle and wanted to figure out how, as the company grew, that the leaders could still stay deeply connected to what was going on in knowing, because knowing the customer experience at a fundamental level, and you know, knowing again, what did my customers experience yesterday, last week, and how can we get better next week? And so, you know, two examples where that happens is, you know, one is with narratives. So we back in this was 2004. We were using slides to communicate issues and to make decisions, and you know, important decisions that, and sometimes have a lot of money or risk involved, and they were only getting bigger as the company was growing. The meetings weren't going too well. We weren't getting all the information we needed. People were kind of interrupting. The question would be answered on the next slide, and after some soul searching and research, and you know, looking up some of what Edward Tufte was an influence on us. He's a professor at Yale about how to visually display you know, information. We realized that we were, even though almost every other company was doing this, they're using slides to make decisions. The slides were not really a good decision-making tool, and so we just switched over to narratives. And you know, for a number of reasons. One is pixel density, and you know, you can get about 7 to 9 times the pixel density. People read faster than they talk. You can handle multi-causal arguments better in a narrative, and you know, all in, you probably get between 10 and 20 times the amount of information from one group or one team to leaders in the same per unit time. So an hour in a slide meeting is the same as an hour in a narrative meeting. We realized as leaders, we could stay deeply connected to a broader number of projects or initiatives that were going on by using narratives. So that's one example of how, and it, you know, and it had a huge impact. Jeff Bezos called it one of the best moves that Amazon has made. And it was a fairly simple change. It took us a while to learn how to write and read and comment on narratives. But really, you know, all in, if you're moving fast and you don't have all the information that you want, but you need to make decisions, if you collect 20 times more information, you're going to make the right call more often than the wrong call using 20 times less information. And so that's one area. And then just in terms, another one I mentioned about the metrics is that you know, you need to. It's not just a weekly business review. If you just take a look at the number of metrics that, even if it's your in between meetings and an elevator, or you're just looking at a flash report about what happened to my customers, and you constantly look at that, that's how you intuit the customer experience. And then that allows you then to make better judgment decisions on, first of all, are things going right, but also what is really missing from a customer experience? What do we need to invent and to go next? Or how can we go from 2-day delivery to 4-hour delivery in this area over time? But by getting all of that data from different areas, you're able to come up with better solutions and focusing on, just that one area, like a single-threaded leader.
Yeah. So that also means that you mentioned having all that information at hand helps you to come up with better solutions. So for me, and maybe I'm interpreting this the wrong way, it means that leaders are also part of the solutionizing process. Is that correct?
Yeah, and so your last part of your question was, as a leader, how do you stop from paraphrasing, from micromanaging or usurping their autonomy and authority? Well, one of the things with these narratives is the way the meetings work is a team. It's not usually an individual. It's a team writes a narrative and submits it to a broader group, and typically a leadership group at whatever level of the company. And everyone has a chance to weigh in on that. And really, you've transferred a whole bunch of information, high bandwidth information in the first 20 minutes, and then you have a 40-minute dialogue on the important things that are going on. And so as leaders, you may either pattern match or question assumptions, or say, this is a great idea, we should be doing more of that. But with this narrative review process, the idea, it really, the owner of the idea is just really spread out now, because everyone has had a chance to weigh in on it, and everyone's very clear on what it is. So you're not relitigating the idea, this is what I thought I heard in a slide presentation, or this is what I thought this bullet point meant. Well, no, with a narrative, you know what it meant, and you have the comments typically in a collaborative document, and the questions answered. So the leaders are helping shape the idea, but they're not really dictating what it should be. So diving deep doesn't necessarily mean micromanaging and saying, I've got all the data, so you should go do this. And you can't really have true innovation that way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cool. So there were 3 examples of leadership principles and how they're interwoven into basically everything that leaders and also teams at Amazon do. And now let's go into some specific areas. And let's start with an area that you already touched, being hiring. One of the leadership principles, if I recall correctly, is hire and develop the best. Yes. Now, there is a specific process that was created over time. And I think this is worth mentioning, because none of these things was created by one person, Jeff or anybody else. And none of these things was just created the way it is lived today, but those things emerged over time. So you iterated on these principles and how they're lived on a daily basis. Now let's go into the hiring process. And I don't know to what extent you're up to date to what the hiring process is today, but you just share with us whatever you know from the days you were still at Amazon and what you covered in your book. And maybe you can connect the process again to the leadership principle of hire and develop the best, and a few others.
Yeah, and and I'll just kick it off by these processes we're talking about. They're the same problems that every growing organization faces. Amazon just stuck with a few core principles and came up with sometimes radically different approaches, and that's what we're trying to talk about in this book, is that you don't have to be a huge multi-billion-dollar conglomerate to use some of these things. Every company needs to know how to hire people better, even if you're going from 10 to 30 people. And so with hiring, what we realized is that we had this is John Vlastelica, the way he put it. He was an HR executive at Amazon back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Put it, we had new people hiring new people, hiring new people. And we were all crammed into one building at this point. And you'll notice that the quality level of the hiring was actually changing quite dramatically from what it used to be. And it wasn't because of ill intentions. Everyone is always trying to do the right thing, but you would get someone who was hired, a manager, they would go to their old company or their network and bring people in, and then they would hire people, but using a different process. And so when you have a different process, it's not repeatable, you're going to have different levels of results. And we realized this would not scale. And so what we did, we created this thing called the bar raisers process. And some of it was based on some hiring techniques that Microsoft used. They called it an as appropriate hiring model. but there are a couple of key components of it. One is that we used behavioral interviewing versus brain teaser questions, because we found that the best predictor of future performance was your past performance. And then the second thing is we wanted to bring in people who would reinforce what Amazon's culture and was all about versus changing the culture. And that's important, especially for an early company. If you ever get the question about, we've gotten a question, well, why is our company changed? A year ago, it seemed like it was different. We were moving much faster. And when we ask, well, do you have a well-known and codified set of leadership principles? If you don't, you're kind of just shooting in the dark and you're going to get what you're going to get. And then the second part is, do you have a deliberate hiring process to make sure that the next person you bring in is going to reinforce the culture or make it something that's more like who they are, that's different from who you are? And when you go from 10 to 30 or 10 to 100, that's how your company changes, and it's not what it was used to be. So having those well-defined leadership principles and then a deliberate process to make sure people reinforce that culture. The other thing that the bar raiser process has is it tries to remove bias wherever we found it. So it's a data-driven exercise where going into an interview, you have a very specific set of tasks that you need to perform. You need to record those, how you got that data. You need to document it. You can't ask, well, how did your interview go? You can't, you can't tell someone this person's great, just go sell this person. Because when an interviewer at Amazon, by definition, I mentioned earlier, they get 2 or 3 leadership principles. By definition, they don't have all of the information to make the true hiring decision. Their job is to go get, how did this candidate embody this subset of leadership principles? And then at the end, after everyone is interviewed, entered their comments and votes, then you get together and you read a narrative document, which is an amalgamation of all of the feedback. Then and only then do you see the whole picture of what everyone, the candidate is about. And you can change your vote at that point. There's no shame in changing your vote once you see the whole puzzle put together. The last thing that Amazon has is called a bar raiser. That's the name of the process, but there's a very specific role. And it's someone who's meant to help guide the interviewing team through this process and help the hiring manager make the decision. The bar raiser is not in the chain of the hiring chain, so they don't really have skin in the game if this person gets hired or not. Their goal is to make sure that the candidate has raised the bar at Amazon. They do have veto power, but it's not really used that often. A great bar raiser is supposed to guide the conversation and really help the team, decide whether this person has made the bar. They can even override the hiring manager also. And so then the last thing is there's a feedback loop in these debrief meetings. I learned something in every in-person debrief meeting about how other interviewers, how'd you get that information? I get little tips and tricks on how they got that or questions they asked. And, I'll help train other people too. And so that debrief, the more you go through the bar raiser process, the better the bar raiser process gets. So those are a couple of unique things. And it's a scalable process too. It started off in product development, but it was one of those processes, it works at a company if you don't have to force other people to use it. Other groups then started asking about, well, how can we get a bar raiser for our organization? And then it just became a standard process at Amazon.
Yeah. And I think what's important is the previous process you laid out, right? New people hire new people, they hire new people. That's also scalable, but the quality doesn't scale.
Yeah.
So what you really created was a process that scaled the quality based on the leadership principles that Amazon wanted to assess in every single candidate. And what I find interesting, and it's great that we're talking, because when I was listening to the book, and maybe my memory doesn't serve me right here, but my understanding was more of the bar raiser being, to some extent, the role of the bar raiser being to some extent like the bad cop. But what I'm hearing right now, it's the bar raiser is more of a facilitator. You mentioned they guide the team to come to a better decision. But yes, they do have veto power, which is not used that often. And I think I like that facilitator approach personally much better. I mean, I like the previous approach as well, because I've seen so many organizations, both startups and scale-ups, where they really get hiring wrong at some point, and that dilutes their culture or gets them into a wrong way of having a good culture. And the bar raiser, I think, is so critical. Now, I think you don't cover in your book how people are then later developed. And is this a topic that we can dive a bit deeper here?
Yeah, certainly it is something that's changed over, over time on how Amazon develops people. So, there wasn't one process. That's why we didn't really cover that. But in terms of, the biggest, the number one reason why people leave a company is the relationship with their manager, and then not feeling valued. So at first we realized that we had a gap. We were growing so quickly. We had a gap in our first and second line managers. A lot of them had never done that before. And being a good manager, one of the encouraging things is it's a teachable skill. But it doesn't always come naturally, and it's not something most people can just intuit and become a great manager. So we put that infrastructure and training in place for first time managers, and not just a training, but that they had a cohort and they can talk about issues as they come up, in a manner that helps them be better managers. Same thing with directors, or kind of the managers managing managers. So that was one thing early on that we realized was missing. And fast growing companies, you never know when to layer in process and training. But as we just had so many new people who were responsible for managing even small teams like 4 or 5 people, it's hugely important to make sure that they are developing every one of their direct reports. And then in terms a large part of Amazon in the earlier days was there wasn't a whole bunch of infrastructure, but we encouraged people to take charge of their own career. So if you needed something, if you needed training, or if you wanted to go out and acquire a new skill, you could work with your manager and go get that. And then we just started to look at some of the common requests and fill those in. But it was more what's one of the lessons I learned is that, no one's going to take charge of your career for you. You may have a good mentor, but they can't read your mind. And so, the advice I try to give people is really focus, know what's important for you and where you want to go, and then work with your mentor or manager to figure out how to go get that within the construct of your own organization.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave us a few examples around building the leadership skills or the managerial skills, right? Because as the organization grows, you also need more managers. Now, Amazon is famous for being one of those companies that really doesn't know or doesn't respect industry boundaries. They're not afraid of going into a completely different industry. And they've demonstrated this, for example, at some point with being initially a retailer for books and other things, but then building their own ebook, the Kindle. And if I remember correctly in your book, you also cover that there was an acquisition of a company in France, but a lot of skills were also built internally, or people were hired so that Amazon, a company that hadn't built hardware products, consumer hardware products, was able to do that and do that exceptionally well. Can you share a bit more on how those hard skills were developed within Amazon?
Yeah, so necessity is the short answer to that. And it is really with the working backwards approach. And so for the Kindle, for instance, after several iterations of writing PRFAQs and really asking ourselves what would make an ebook experience great. And that process it's all about truth seeking and discovering what the fundamental truths of the customer experience are. It's not about you. It's not about competitors. It's really saying what needs to be created in order for this to be a fantastic customer experience. And we realized that we needed a couple of things. We realized there was no value in the middle anymore. As a physical e-commerce retailer, there was value in collecting lots of different goods in a warehouse and putting 2 of them in a box and shipping them into a customer, when you can get a book and an electronic device. That aggregation created value. With ebooks or music or even videos, creating a catalog of all of the videos produced or all the songs produced or ebooks, it's hard, but it's not really differentiated. There are lots of companies who can do that, not every company, but we realized so that the value is floating out and the customer value is floating out to either end of the spectrum. We realized a couple of things. One is what would make an ebook great would be we need to control the device because that's where a bunch of the innovation was going to happen. So we realized, all right, we're going to need to be a device maker. We're not. People thought it was a silly thing for Amazon to do back then. We literally were just getting reasonably competent at putting stuff in our warehouse and shipping it in 3 to 5 days to customers. And now, Steve Kessel and Bill Carr, who were the 2 of the first people in digital, along with Jeff Bezos, were saying, okay, we need to be a device manufacturer. That's a completely different business, but we realized 75% of our existing business at the time was physical shipment of physical books, CDs and DVDs. And that was a lot of it was going to go away. So if we wanted to participate in media in a digital format, we had no choice to figure out how to be a good device manufacturer. There were other things we realized about ebooks. It had to have a new screen technology. And that was one that we worked with a partner with e-ink to get. We realized we had to have an unlimited catalog, and that, this is kind of where you can sprinkle in long-term thinking and invention, as storage cost was roughly following Moore's law. If you get double the performance every 2 years, in 5 years you've got 32 times the amount of storage for the same price. You don't take that savings and move it to the bottom line because storage at that point cost was relatively small compared to Amazon's fixed structure. You figure out with 32 times more storage for the same price, what can we do with it? Well, we can scan every book. And, and that allowed us to get into ebooks faster too. But so those are examples of how you realize that we need to go do these new things. And then you have to be honest with yourself. Can we do it? One area where I would say we realized we were at a competitive disadvantage. We realized people were starting their product searches more on Google versus Amazon. And so we tried a search engine, it was called A9.com, because we said, well, we have to take a go at it because we want to be the place of first resort where people are looking for products. We hedged our bets. So, we tried web search, but we also said we need to make every product page have an insane amount of information where that is the best place on the web to find out information about this product. So we had a 2-pronged strategy. Turns out doing web search it didn't work, so we canceled that. It doesn't mean that was not a worthy experiment. But that was something where we said, we don't know how to do it yet. We're going to try it. But we realized the better path was creating such a great experience on Amazon.com through marketplace, through high quality detail pages, through low prices, fast delivery, that people would go there to Amazon to start their product search.
Mm-hmm. So this is incredible. Now, you mentioned in brief, necessity is what makes an organization build new skills. Now let's move from the organizational level to the people level, because one challenge that I see at many of my clients, and I just give you an example, they have Java developers and now they want to build iOS and Android apps. Yeah, to Android that travels or transfers really well, but to iOS it doesn't. Now, how do you get those people to build up that new skill set? What is your experience? What can an organization do? What can a manager, a leader do to give the people the right space so that they are willing to build up that new skill set?
One thing you can do, so, Amazon has a learn and be curious leadership principle that we look at when we hire people, so if someone says, I'm a Java developer, I always have been, I always will be, they're at a disadvantage in the interviewing process. So we look for people who are passionate about customer experience, about technology, about learning new things. So, to move from one area to another, especially in a fast moving industry, I personally think it's a necessary attribute of someone to have. So getting people who really want to go explore new things, it is one. So you can solve that problem a little, well, help make it less upstream. But in terms of giving people the space, again, it starts from the customer obsession. If you realize you need iOS, Android, mobile web, then you don't have a choice. You've got to do all those four. And it's really, if your goal is to serve customers, then you figure out how you're going to organize in order to get that, to do that. Or if you realize, hey, machine learning is now a better way to give personalized recommendations than looking at data and coming up, having very large brains come up with algorithms on their human-based algorithms to figure out what personalization is. You realize, all right, we're going to try to disrupt our whole personalization infrastructure with machine learning, and we'll see which one's going to win. And you have to have that spirit of invention and be willing, hey, we tried it, didn't work, but what's the next best idea? So don't be too down. Jeff Bezos has a good saying, it's not an experiment if you know it's going to work going into it. So, if you're going to be willing to experiment, you also have to be willing to fail in some cases. So I think a large part of it is just the context of, well, who you bring in, and then how you really define the problem. And really the customer experience will dictate what you have to do. It's not you dictate, well, how can we build something, and then based on our current capabilities, and then try to foist it on customers and convince them that that's what they want.
Yeah, and I think that's very, very good advice. So what I usually tell startup founders is always, don't fall in love with your idea, fall in love with the problem you want to solve, which then again relates to the customer obsession, because once you really understand that problem and are passionate about solving it, you will find different ways of doing that. Even if your initial idea is not the right one, or even if your initial skill set is not necessary and you need to build new skills, you then have the passion and the energy to go build those new skills. So let's move from this to the topic of organizing. You brought it up a bit earlier, the single-threaded leader, and there's also the concept of single-threaded teams. Can you define for our audience a bit more what that concept is? And then I have a few follow-up questions on that probably.
Sure. A single-threaded leader is someone who, if an initiative is it's big enough and it's worth doing, you should have a leader who has the seniority, experience, and capability in order to make that vision a reality. And, by the way, it can be a 5-person team, or it could be a 500-person team. I don't think it scales, and it has this fractal quality. But and then you need to ask yourself, and this was some of the FAQs that Amazon would have, is what are the dependencies you have today that are preventing you from moving forward fast enough, and what are you going to do in order to remove those dependencies? So asking, where do I have to go talk to other groups a lot? We realized when we were starting to move to this model, if you measured the building and doing time versus the coordinating and talking about doing time, that scale was tilting in the wrong direction. And, you have two choices at that point. You can build collaboration tools, decision-making tools, and, communication protocols. And again, we rejected that approach, and we said, how can we get rid of that? Ideally make it zero, and have it 100% doing. Turns out you can't do that. 100%. I liken dependencies as taxes. No one likes paying them, but you want to try to minimize them, but you can't get rid of them, and so you always want to look at it, where the dependencies, is that dependency actually valuable or not? But sometimes those dependencies are technical, and you'll have to, tease apart a code base that, especially if you built fast in the beginning, you have to know when to decouple and break those into, whether they're microservices or whatever you want, architecture you want. Sometimes they're organizational, and where if you have to go to another group, or you get assigned a product manager or a designer, and then that person gets assigned somewhere else, and you have new people on your initiative every quarter or every sprint, that spin up time is, you need to try to reduce that. So we realized, single-threaded leader is looking at dependencies, gaining control of all the important dependencies, so you have control over your own destiny. You also have the resources to get the job done, and the autonomy. And there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that too. So we realized that was the best way, in order to make progress. There's a great quote from Dave Limp, he's the senior vice president of devices. He said, the best way to fail at inventing something is to make it someone's part-time job. And so it's hard if you've got 5 or 6 competing initiatives. You typically will go migrate to either the biggest one or the most urgent one. And sometimes the most important one will be a business that doesn't exist. And it's really hard to do that if your day job is trumping everything else that you should be, your focus on that. And the last thing I'll mention on this more is how do you spend your time when I was working with Jeff Bezos, he over-indexed his time on digital. So, figuring out it literally was digital. We didn't know whether it was what Kindle was at that point. It was, how do we take this 75% of the online physical business and figure out how to disrupt it. And then web services, those businesses didn't exist, but a good chunk of his calendar was focused on that, not the multi-billion-dollar thing that was paying the bills, because Jeff felt that these were too big opportunities worthy of investigation. So, that's what single-threaded leadership is all about: is removing dependencies and thinking about the same thing every day, because that's where the invention really comes in.
Mm-hmm. So 2 things here. So contrary to many CEOs who prioritize their calendar, or basically give shares of their calendar proportionally to the amount of revenue a certain business area does, Jeff was doing it the other way, focusing primarily on areas that were still not existent, but he believed were great opportunities going forward. Did I get that correct?
Well, I would say it's the latter part is correct, the biggest opportunities. Sometimes your biggest opportunities also align with the biggest business.
Exactly.
And so it's really the biggest opportunities. Jeff also had very capable leaders, and at that time, running the fulfillment and transport and the retail business. The focus did shift back over, when with Amazon Prime, and then same day delivery and Prime Air. So it changes over time. You don't always focus on what is the bright new shiny experimental idea. He just felt that those were very large total addressable markets and wanted to make sure it was going off in the right direction. And when Andy Jassy started, the team started hitting their stride, he pulled back and was focusing on devices, for instance, was the next area. But so the biggest opportunity, and it may or may not necessarily align with your biggest current business.
Yeah, and that's where you probably want to put your focus on as a leader. And
Yep.
and the second piece was the single-threaded leaders taking on impediments. And I don't know if this was part of your book or whether I read it somewhere else or heard it from some of my friends that worked at Amazon, was that no initiative gets started unless there's a leader saying, yep, I'll make sure that I remove those impediments. Is that correct?
Yeah, in order for an initiative to get started, you have to write a PRFAQ and convince yourself and in the, whoever is responsible for greenlighting resources. It could be you, as you could have control over them, or it could you have to go ask for more resources for the company. But then the question is, okay, who is going to be the single-threaded leader that owns this? Because a lot of reasons why projects don't get done is just because it's no one's top priority. And
exactly.
yeah, and so I think we did mention fulfillment by Amazon was an example in the book that we mentioned. We had that idea for a long time, but it was hard because it intersected with the marketplace business, with the fulfillment center, with transport, and also with the ordering pipeline on the website. And those people are all pretty busy. And we could never really get the resources necessary to put all that glued together. And it wasn't until Jeff Bezos said, he told Jeff Wilkie, you need to assign, and this is a VP level job, so you need to pull a VP off of whatever they're doing and focus on this and nothing but this. And it was Tom Taylor who did that. And so after about 2 years, literally, of fits and starts, it wasn't until Tom really started to get his team focused around what it wasn't even called fulfillment by Amazon FBA at that point. Yeah. Focused on that, nothing but that. Then progress went relatively quickly.
Yeah, and so I think this is a great and very simple prioritization technique, because when I look at many organizations that I work with, the teams there and individuals and leaders are looking at so many projects, but there are many projects that are nobody's full-time job. And those projects take ages. And I'm sure you're now working with many organizations yourself, so you see that pattern as well. And I think just having this simple principle of a single-threaded leader, or practice, it's not a principle, it's a practice, would help many organizations to just become much better at this.
Yeah, it's
now,
easier.
A single-threaded leader is one thing. Yep.
Oh, I was just going to say, I was just going to say, we realized that doing global prioritization, comparing apples to oranges, or, a feature in web services to should we build a new device, that is global prioritization is super hard. And if you have to do that on a quarterly or, biweekly basis on comparing apples to oranges, only madness lies down that path as far as I'm concerned. So what Amazon did is they tried to make an allocation decision earlier upstream to say, here's a general space. How, what is our appetite and what can we afford to invest in this area, and let the team innovate in this area. And that way they don't have to convince, beg, borrow, and steal resources every 2 weeks or every quarter, or to say, how can we get this done because there's something new. So we make fewer allocation decisions fewer prioritization decisions on a frequent basis, by making a broad allocation decision on a yearly basis, and sometimes quarterly if there's a new initiative, and then getting a team that's focused on that. And that way you just avoid comparing things where the error bars are so high anyway on how long it takes to build, what the consumer adoption is going to be, when you can hire people in order to do this. Your error bar is already higher than your estimate of what is the return on investment. So you're probably better off saying, this is an idea that's worth putting 5 people on for 2 years, and we're going to see what the payback is, and the innovation over that. So that is allocation versus prioritization is another thing to think about when you're figuring out, what do I do next? Am I using the right decision-making tool for the job?
Yeah. So, and that ties in really well with the topic that I wanted to deep dive a bit on. We talked about the leader. Now, about the teams. My assumption is that most of those single-threaded teams are really working full-time on this one initiative. And it's not like the people in those teams are spread across 5 different projects where they have to allocate around 20% of their time. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the team, you can also be organized, functionally too. It's just that where you spend the bulk of the time, so for something like legal, you don't have your own lawyer on a small, team like that. There's a central legal department, but if needed, they spend the bulk of their time on that initiative. Same thing with design, data science, software engineers, product managers can work that way. And when the org gets big enough, then you can have your own functional organization as a leader if you want. So the org structure is independent of where you spend your time and focus. But yes, when you're on a team, it's the team makes the decision about what comes next. It's not those functional organizations, simply because they don't have enough information. They're not working on that on a day-to-day basis. So, the role of those functional leaders becomes less telling what each of these individual groups to do, and it becomes more of how do I share best practices from my product managers, from my software engineers, designers, whatever, across all of these different initiatives, and how do I make sure that they're growing their careers and we're making the best types of decisions. And there are different models on how to do it. Spotify's got one, and so it's but the general concept is, when you're on the team is in control of their own destiny.
Yeah, I think that's very important, because otherwise you get into a lot of conflicts with regards to how do you allocate your time as an individual. And then most of the projects just do suffer, and they take much longer than they would have taken if people were more focused on those things.
Yeah.
Now, we've talked about hiring, we've talked about organizing. Let's go into the working backwards approach itself, and then connect this to the HBR article you wrote in April of, it was published in April of this year. I assume you wrote it a bit earlier. So what is working backwards in a few sentences? And then where would you see the connection or the disconnect to what a lot of people consider as being agile?
Yeah, so working backwards, it's, like we talked about earlier, it's the process of taking an idea and vetting it to decide whether it's worthwhile to go build or to allocate resources to go build the product or service. And in order to do that, you take an idea and you start from really the customer perspective. The first thing you do is, and then work backwards from that. The first thing you do is you identify what is the customer problem I am trying to solve. Sounds very simple, but it's harder than you might think, especially if you're trying to invent something brand new. And it's an iterative process. So you say, what is the problem I'm trying to solve? What is my solution? And then you have to convince a customer, why should they buy this product or use this feature? Why should they change their behavior from what's out there today? And what's the benefit in that for them? And it's a one-page press release. And you write that press release, you show it to whoever you need to, and you read that. And if you're not super excited about, and you know what the problem is, and you're super excited about going out and like, I want to buy this, or I can't wait till I'm using this on a daily basis, you go back and you rewrite the press release. So this is an iterative process. The second part is you have an FAQ document that accompanies that. You can break them out into really two categories of frequently asked questions, internal and external. So external FAQs are something that you would explain to the press or to customers about how much is this going to cost me? Why is this better than what's out on the market today? How often should I use it? The internal ones are the hard questions and answers that you need to ask and answer about how we're going to organize to take this vision and solve this problem for customers and make it a reality. Can we build a device, a reading device with a price point, with a bill of materials for under $250 with these 4 components, with the radio, a new screen technology, virtually unlimited selection and low prices. That, by the way, those 4 things are really, really hard to do. But those, and then you'd have facts to say, well, how are we going to do those 4 things? That also is an iterative process. And when you have the team and and then the green lighting team, so managers looking at that, you don't move on to the next step until you may be missing a fact, and so you have got to go back and rewrite that or do more analysis, or you may not have answered it sufficiently. A lot of ideas do not make it through the PRFAQ stage, and that is by design. And so what the PRFAQ document is this is our best idea at what is a customer problem, how we're going to organize and solve it, and why it's worth solving. A number of reasons why it may not make it through. Probably the biggest one is that the total addressable market is just not big enough. It may be a great idea, but once you whittle down, well, who would actually use this and be willing to pay for this, or who is it's just too small to be worth doing compared to your other investments. Sometimes there could be unsolved or technology issues that you don't think that you can solve, or other market forces. But once it gets greenlit, then you can allocate resources and go start building part of that. And where the other thing to keep in mind is that this process, again, it goes back to ownership and long-term thinking. It's meant to conserve your bottleneck resources, which are typically product development resources, software engineers, product managers, designers. Building prototypes takes a long time, and in iterating and just kind of throwing stuff out there and seeing what sticks, there's a cost to each of these experiments. And so you need to recognize what the cost is. And writing documents, especially a press release, anyone can do it. And these FAQs, it's a lot cheaper than building a product and launching it and then having to refactor it if it takes off. And or you realize, well, we didn't quite solve we thought we were solving this problem, but it's actually customers want something different. So, that rework process takes a whole lot of time. So all in, if you take a look at the time from idea to when the product has gained traction, we found that the working backwards using long-term thinking, it actually gets you to where you want to go quicker. And really it's because you're not zigging and zagging, you know where you want to end up. And it took a little longer in the beginning. You went slower in the beginning, but then everyone was aligned on what it is that matters. What's the problem we're solving? What problem aren't we solving? So that is what I think that the PRFAQ gave us. And I'll give you one specific example before you talk about the HBR article. As with web services, we didn't really know, like the term cloud computing did not exist. We just knew, hey, there's this web services thing it's interesting. We're realizing our developers are using this in unique and innovative ways. Our customers are asking us for some of this. What can we develop? And one particular problem we had was teams, they would build a service, but to actually build and deploy that service at Amazon, about a third of that, at least a third of that, and it was at least 6 weeks of the time, was just provisioning hardware, doing the hardware sizing, getting it ready, having the network engineer set it up, configuring that across different data centers. You'd have to do all of that work over and over again, and everyone was doing the same thing. And then you have to reclaim that when it didn't work, and so we were spending all sorts of money, so that we should have been deploying elsewhere. But the team started started off as provisioning, and then we realized through the PRFAQ process, what we were really creating was execution services or compute power. And that was the unit of measure that we were doing. So that journey from it was the PRFAQ that allowed us to discover, well, what are we actually trying to solve for customers? And in this case, it was offering on-demand compute power. And the light really went off when, I don't know who wrote it, but they get a lot of credit for writing this, when they said, we want to give a person in a college dorm room access to the same world-class infrastructure that a developer at Amazon, Google, or Microsoft would have on a variable cost basis. And that really, then we started to iterate a lot faster, and that's where you get things like EC2 and S3.
Yeah.
So
cool.
That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about. Now, let me dive into this. Now, when I can assume if a traditional manager who has been accustomed to a waterfall product development approach hears this, would say, oh, so we don't need this whole agile thing. Let's just continue with our waterfall approach. What are the different, but I think there are tremendous differences between PRFAQ, as you were outlining it, compared to a traditional waterfall approach. But I don't want to make too many assumptions. So I'm asking you, what are the biggest differences from your perspective?
Well, so I am a big Agile fan. I just think that, you know, and I think that they actually can work in conjunction. Yeah, and so, you know, one difference is what, you know, waterfall has these distinct stages. The PRFAQ, some of these are very, very detailed about how can we do this? Can we actually build this hardware device that cheap, and then convince me how we're going to do it in a document before you get, you know, $50 million or, you know, 50 people to go build a center, or $1 million and 5 people. It doesn't, you know, again, it doesn't matter. So you do have to go in. Some of these PRFAQs we read and reviewed for web services are deeply technical. And, you know, in terms of S3, a lot of them were focused on what are the failure modes? How can we scale in an unlimited fashion? You know, because at the time, the redundancy, what storage providers were using to have the redundancy, it was super expensive. And the failure modes were catastrophic in some cases. You'd be better off failing one every 10,000 requests and just doing a retry than having 15 minutes of downtime a year for every company on the internet for the same 15 minutes. That's not a good thing, failure mode to have. And so we had to figure out how can we invent different types of, you know, swarm technologies and the dynamo storage to, you know, the whole eventual consistency and the trade-off you make. So you get very detailed in some of these FAQs. But how they work together. So, you know, I think where we've seen Agile essentially be misused, and this isn't just, it's with you just need to be careful when the process takes over what you are doing, the process takes over what you're doing, and the process becomes the thing in and of itself. So a lot of times the words MVP mean you get to run to the front of the line in organizations in terms of resource allocations. Oh, we're working on an MVP, so I'm going to get my you know, resources needed, and I have to go launch in 2 weeks. You know, so those things, if you're just following the process for the process itself, and it's controlling you, you need to step back and say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And a lot of times it's not a good thing because it prevents you from making different types of decisions. So where working backwards can work in conjunction with Agile, in some cases, it may take more than 2 weeks to figure out what to do next. And you can break it up into 2-week chunks, but you know, it took us a while to figure out what is a good e-reader worth building. You know, like did we need to build it? Did it need to have an always-on radio? Could we use existing screen technology, or did we have to go with something like an e-ink where you don't have a million small lights shining right in your eye for 3 hours and you have to, you know, to go test that? But and so I think that some of the pushback is, well, the process says every 2 weeks or whatever your cadence is, so we've got to go do this. That process may or may not be the right thing for whatever the particular problem is. And so you want to step back and say, what is the you know, the long, if you take the long-term approach, what is the best way to deliver customer value, you know, as quickly as possible to maximize the, you know, the value for customers. And so I think working backwards can help as an input into Agile about, you know, okay, now we know what we're going to do. So now you can break it up into whatever chunks and start to build and launch these things. But when those 2-week chunks are preventing you from seeing the big picture, that's when you may need to change a bit or adopt a bit.
Yeah, thank you for that. And my understanding, so again, comparing the PRFAQ or the working backwards approach to a traditional waterfall, is that the PRFAQ or working backwards is very much customer centric, right? It is tied into customer obsession as one of the things. And many waterfall approaches are mostly about what are the requirements that we need to get done, not taking account of the customer that much. And the other thing is, from my understanding, reading the book, talking to other people at Amazon, is the creation of the PR FAQ itself is a highly collaborative and a highly iterative approach, right? The first person or a team writes it, and it's a one pager, and then other people read it, they give feedback, and then you get to see that there are some assumptions, and I assume that many of those assumptions are being tested. So it's not like we're in a hypothetical world and we're just doing analysis, but we see what those assumptions are. We go do some more analysis, maybe we do some other tests, but through all of these things, we try to reduce the number of assumptions that you're making or our uncertainty on those assumptions, and ultimately come up with a pretty good still vision. We might have the key characteristics of a product outlined. You mentioned like the initial Kindle had connection to the internet so that people could always download a book. And I have one of those devices at home. But the details, they are not part of that, right? They are uncovered by the teams once they go build those things. Is that correct?
Well, it depends. Sometimes you can have a PRFAQ solely focused on what does radio technology look like? Because at this time, it was the only thing you had that had the radio technology was a cell phone when you had a monthly plan. So could we go even have a device that's always on with no plan with a mobile carrier that has enough bandwidth and doesn't consume too much battery power, so we can read for 2 weeks? We had to go test some of that. We actually had to go build and prototype some things. So sometimes you have to go a couple steps in a specific direction in order to convince yourself, yes, we've defined the problem. We know it's doable. We don't know all of the details yet, but now we can allocate our bottleneck resources to go make this thing a reality. So it's more customer obsessed, but then also the idea is, once you have your PRFAQ, everyone's had a chance to weigh in on it. So it's the things that succeed and fail. Someone may have started and come up with the idea, but by the time it gets greenlit, there are a lot of people who have shaped that idea, made it better, taken parts out and then replaced it. So the failure and success of these things that come out through this process, it's jointly owned as far as I'm concerned, and so like the Fire Phone was not a success at Amazon from a product perspective. There were many senior leaders who read many PRFAQs and weighed in and said, yes, this is worth doing. So it wasn't the person who came up with the Fire Phone who bore all of that, the consequences or responsibility for that decision, not consequences, because it was an experiment. But so that is another point about the PRFAQ. It's meant to collect feedback and make the best decision given imperfect information as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and as quickly as possible, and also as cheaply as possible, because you were referring to resources earlier, right? So if everything that we want to reduce uncertainty on always requires us to build stuff and get a ton of resources involved, that the cost of feedback just becomes more expensive. The cost of learning becomes more expensive. And through the PRFAQ and the working backwards approach, you try to also reduce that cost of feedback.
And you can get pushback there quite often with S3, the storage. Software engineers were chomping at the bit to get this thing launched, but we just realized it wasn't architected the right way, and we hadn't quite discovered it. But if we had launched it, that was based on a different type of storage paradigm and the back end, we would have spent all our time just treading water and trying to keep version 1 alive and not really gotten to version 2 faster. Now, not everyone may agree with that assessment, and it is a judgment call. And in this case, I think that the data bears out that it it worked out pretty well. Was it the best outcome ever? I don't know.
Nobody knows.
But yeah, you can't. It's a destructive experiment. You can't go replay it. But so that's where the a judgment comes in on when does it make sense to slow down in order to speed up in the long run.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the term slowdown. In your book, you refer to Jeff referring to himself as the chief slowdown officer from time to time. I assume from time to time he was also the chief like speed up officer, but that's just my assumption. But slowing down, how did he do that as a leader? Like, at what points did he come in and say, hey, team, we need to slow down a bit? And what were his arguments or his reasons for that?
It was really in the narrative review. So where a team would come in and say, either here's the problem we're trying to solve. He would question every assumption. Is this really the problem we are trying to solve? Have we gotten to the heart of the solution? Is this enough to make a difference in the customer experience? So it was slowing down primarily by asking questions about uncovering the fundamental truth about what we are trying to do. That and to come up with those answers, it's really hard. Does the Kindle need only these 3 things? Does it just need a great screen technology and vast selection and lower prices, or do we need this radio to where you're taking off on the runway and before your coverage is going to go out, you can download a new book, and so that asking, and is it 4 or is it 6? Do we really need these 2? So throwing out stuff is just as important and so it's primarily through asking questions and discovering what is the fundamental truth about the customer experience we're trying to create and the problems we're trying to solve. But then once you have that, okay, when how do we get that tomorrow, or now,
when is it done?
Yeah, and or for category expansion or reducing delivery speed, we know that's virtuous in and of itself. So we move super fast in order to expand categories, reduce delivery speed, innovations to get things out quicker to customers. So you slow down when necessary, but then moving fast and speed. Velocity, it's really velocity is the most important thing. And so it has the directional component and as well as the speed is important. And so once you know where you're going, then it's the speed vector, part of that vector that's the driving factor.
Yeah, but if you don't know where you're going and where you're supposed to go, and you're going really fast in any other direction, it doesn't really matter that you're going fast.
That's the zigging and
might
zagging.
Actually, be quite. You only have the zigging and zagging if you still get feedback. But if you're just running without getting the feedback, you're just going in the wrong direction, and that's not helpful to anybody. And I think this is in your article. You put this also very nicely, and I will. Everyone who's listening here, I will share that article with you. It's an HBR article, and I think there's a number of free articles anybody can read a month. And it really sums up well how a lot of people in the Agile space only think about speed and don't think about direction that much, and which is then the velocity, as you mentioned, right? The speed and the vector. And I think it's really important to consider, well, no matter whether you're using working backwards or design thinking or whatever other approach which puts the customer in the center, gives you a good understanding of the needs, helps you eliminate or reduce the assumptions that you have about the customer, their problems, and their willingness to adopt a new product before you really jump into the actual product development are great things to use. So we have like 10, 15 more minutes, and I want to go into 2 more topics. One of them is metrics. And you mentioned that briefly, right? Not looking at output metrics that much, looking at input metrics. And the last topic would be being an Amazonian beyond Amazon. And I think we can use, and the reason I'm bringing this up is, yes, we can apply a lot of the things that Amazon is doing within our own organizations, no matter the scale, but probably there are also skills or things that Amazon is doing that we can apply to non-work, right? The role that we play as citizens in a society, et cetera. And I'd like to get your perspective on that, because you triggered some thoughts when I was reading the book or listening to the book. But let's go into metrics briefly first. So how does Amazon look at metrics? And can you give us a few examples of input metrics instead of the traditional, more common output metrics?
Mm-hmm. So, common output metrics are things like revenue, and NPS is an output metric, free cash flow per share. So free cash flow per share, the amount of cash that a company generates divided by the number of outstanding shares. That is something Amazon has strove to maximize that number over time. But what we learned pretty early on, and kudos to people like Tom Skutak, who was the CFO in the late in the 2000s, really helped us realize that if you want to drive those things, just focusing exclusively on those, you won't get there as fast as you need to, and sometimes you'll even make the wrong types of decisions. So, and then looking at the right time horizon. So, if you have a revenue number and then you just tell the team to go increase revenue because I told the board we're going to generate this much revenue by the end of the quarter, they'll take that to heart and they'll go do that. They'll do things like maybe promotions, fire sales, and typically what that does is it brings future demand into the current period. It doesn't really create long-term value, and at the next quarter you're in the same hole you were in before. Plus, you've kind of wasted the resources, thinking and creating those things because it was a one-time event. So you didn't really accrue any long-term value. So what Amazon realized early on was that identifying what are the set of actions that if you do those things right, and you have control over them, by the way, then it will yield the desired result in your output metrics. And that Amazon came up with the concept of Amazon's flywheel, and tip of the hat to Jim Collins in his book Good to Great talks about the flywheel. We were heavily influenced by that, and looked at, well, what are the things that Amazon, if we do these things right, that will maximize the free cash flow per share output metric over a period of years. So the time horizon matters too. And so it turns out it was lowering the cost structure, and that has a series of metrics underneath that. And delivery convenience, which is a good chunk of it, is delivery speed and selection. Now, I'm simplifying, but those are three high-level categories of input metrics. So now for selection, you have your own inventory teams that need to constantly, so we had this big matrix of what are all the categories, who are the teams and geographies. It was mostly empty when we started. And to say, here's our plan to check these things off to where we can offer musical instruments in France and Japan by this time. And but then you also need a marketplace. We realized that we couldn't do it all on our own. At the time when we were thinking about doing marketplace, the biggest retailer in the U.S. was Walmart at that time. They were, I think, about they're $300 to $400 billion in revenue. They were only 8% of the retail market. So, and this was like in the early 2000s, which Walmart was huge. Looking at that to say, even if we get to that level, we're still only a few percentage points. So how can we participate in the other 90% of the market? And so part of selection was creating this marketplace infrastructure, getting third-party sellers. In terms of the other parts of the customer experience, lowering the cost structure, there's a whole set of metrics on what have we done. If you go up and down the P&L, to get gross margins lower, to get better rebates from vendors, to answer customer service calls more effectively. A lot of that is driven by customer experience. You look at what are customers complaining about? How do we fix those defects? How can we push it to self-service? Or how can we change the process? Delivery speed, what can we do in order to ship products 3 minutes faster, for 15 minutes faster over the next month? And in the flywheel, the nice thing about that is if you work on any of those things, they pay dividends once they're launched, but also 5-10 years from now. So you don't have to argue, is this worth doing as much? It's more a sequencing issue versus is it worth doing? And I mentioned earlier, if you're to take a look at that retail weekly business review deck, virtually 80% of the metrics would be those custom on the fly. They would measure what's happening to the flywheel. And those are, customers notice those. We also realize speed matters in terms of page view speed. So how many milliseconds does each service render their bits of the page, and then what is the time to glass, either through the app or the website that the customer sees. How many times did we miss a promise where we said you can get this product in 6 hours and 24 minutes, and we didn't deliver, and then we look at the root cause of, well, why did we miss that promise to customers? The tricky thing is you have to identify the link between your input metrics and your output metrics. It's, again, that sounds easy, but it's harder than it sounds. And the only way that, the best way we found is start with your best guess at what those are, start measuring that, and you'll see if I work on these activities, does it have the desired result? Sometimes you get the metrics wrong. Sometimes they're too high level, composite metrics. Like NPS is a great example. Is that an input metric? Well, it turns out it's an output metric. You have to really say, what are the components that drive NPS? And exactly. They may be different. And then you measure those, and you may need 15 metrics to say, well, what are the 15 metrics that are going to edge our NPS score up over time? And then focus on those. So you have to get that linkage correct. Amazon does focus on output metrics, but they realize the best way to get there is to identify your controllable input metrics, because that's what, that's where autonomy, you can actually ask a team to say, go increase selection. You can't say, we want to increase free cash flow per share by 15% next year. Go do that. They just don't know what to do with that question.
Absolutely. And I think the focus is really, or the emphasis is really on what can you control, right? What is it that we control? Because only the things that we control, we can also commit to, right? So when we're in the agile space, a lot of people talk about teams need to make commitments. They cannot commit to output metrics, but what they can do is to commit to certain input metrics related to certain tasks. And I think that's really good. And I would invite a lot of people in that space that are thinking about their organization, making some kind of transformational change. Really look at the metrics that you also need to change incentives, etc., bringing in long-term perspective, but really focusing on the things that individuals, teams, and then the whole organization can control compared to the results that then they achieve based on the tasks that they do.
And customer facing. Yeah. Customer
facing, absolutely. So the final 5 minutes of our interview, Colin, I would like to focus on beyond Amazon, being an Amazonian beyond Amazon. That's the final chapter of your book as well. There are certain things that I think all organizations can do. What do you think about what individuals can take for their role in society, in family, in whatever? Like, we all play various roles based on the people that we live with, right? So what are the key lessons that you probably took away from your time at Amazon for the remainder of your life?
So I would kind of encapsulate that into really just, I learned the difference between customer obsession and customer focus. And it's hard to switch back from that. And then just thinking long-term, really the light went on when I realized that thinking long-term doesn't mean taking longer to get to where you want to go. Most often, it often gets you there faster. In invention, I personally just like, and I migrate to industries where there's a lot of invention, where there's, things are fundamentally different 2-3 years from now than they are today. That's exciting to me, like learning new things. And then just being a very good, crisp operator, where and that just means that the little details do matter. And I think that often is what separates great companies from good companies, is that if you see a problem, you own it. If there's a defect, you fix it. You don't let it, pass it on. And that most of the work that you do as individuals or a team is really not going to get recognized or celebrated by anyone but yourself. So the pride from getting things right has to come from within. Recognition is fine, and so it's great to get a pat on the back, but getting something right that you're really proud of, that motivation needs to come within. So that those are things that I took away from Amazon, and I think they can be applied in a couple of different areas. And I started off by saying all of these processes are company problems that every organization faces. We don't claim that it's the only way to run an organization, but we just tried to explain some of these really advances in management science that Amazon has created. We think they're worthy of study, and you may or may not choose to incorporate some of these into your own groups or organizations. But there's some new concepts there that it may trigger thinking in a different way. We're not out trying to make the world like Amazon, but it's just we try to put this all together in one body of work. First attempt at doing that to really help the next generation of business leaders get to where they want to go faster and have fun doing it.
Yeah, and take their organizations with them. So, yes, Colin, I don't know how to thank you, so I just say thank you. It was a pleasure having this conversation. I could go on for hours, but I know you have a ton of other things to do today as well, and our audience is this way too. So thank you for taking the time, speaking to us, sharing your insights. Similarly, as I mentioned early on, I encourage everyone to read the book, because we just covered the tip of the iceberg in this conversation. And yes, it was great hosting you, Colin.
Great. Thanks so much for inviting me, and great questions.
Yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Okay,
Bye.
great. See ya. Bye-bye.